Growing up in a household where favoritism was as blatant as the sun in the sky, I was constantly overshadowed by my sister, the so-called golden child. From the moment I could understand the concept of fairness, it was clear that my parents' love and attention were disproportionately lavished on her. It wasn't just subtle, it was a glaring, in-your-face kind of favoritism that left me feeling like an outsider in my own home. Every achievement of hers was celebrated with fanfare, while my accomplishments were brushed aside as if they were nothing. If she accused me of something, my parents would believe her without question, and I'd be punished even when I had undeniable proof of my innocence. But if I dared to point out her wrongdoings, even with evidence, I was scolded for being jealous or causing trouble. It was a never-ending cycle of injustice that left me feeling invisible and worthless. My sister, the golden child, was the center of our family universe. She could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, and she knew it. She wielded that power like a weapon, using it to manipulate and control not just me, but our entire household. My birthdays were never about me. My cake always had to be her favorite flavor, even though I hated it. My parents pretended not to notice, as if my preferences didn't matter. Family outings were always centered around her desires, even when the occasion was supposed to be about me. It was as if I didn't exist, or worse, as if I was merely an afterthought in their lives. As we grew older, her behavior only worsened. She was spoiled rotten, and it showed in every aspect of her personality. She had no friends, and I couldn't tell if it was because they had moved away or simply ditched her because of her mean-spirited nature. We were never close, so I didn't know the details, but I could see the emptiness in her social life. Meanwhile, I managed to carve out a small space for myself, finding solace in my friendships and popularity at school. But that only made her resent me more. She went from ignoring me to actively trying to tear me down. She became obsessed with ruining my life, accusing me and my friends of things we didn't do, and my parents, of course, believed her every word. Her accusations became so frequent and outrageous that my parents started restricting my social life. They'd say things like, "Your sister says your friends aren't good people," or "Why can't you be like your sister and enjoy family time?" It was suffocating. I was isolated, trapped in a home where I was constantly belittled and controlled. The only saving grace was my extended family. My cousins and aunts saw through the facade and offered me a lifeline, but even that came with consequences. When I confided in them about how I wasn't allowed to have friends because my sister didn't have any, my parents found out and punished me for lying. I was grounded for a month, but it was worth it because after that, they gave me a little more freedom. Still, the damage was done. My sister's jealousy and manipulation had turned my life into a living nightmare. Her behavior reached new heights of cruelty when she changed schools. The humiliation of our extended family knowing about her lack of friends was too much for her to bear, so she demanded to switch schools, and my parents, as always, obliged without question. At her new school, she managed to make friends, but her newfound social life didn't make her any kinder to me. If anything, it made her worse. She had tasted the power of control, and she was addicted to it. She never let me forget that she held the reins in our family, and she used that power to make my life miserable. Her friends would come over and join in on the bullying, laughing at me and calling it light teasing. My parents never intervened, always taking her side. I stopped inviting friends over because I knew it would only end in disaster. My sister would accuse them of stealing, and my parents would believe her without question. It was a never-ending cycle of humiliation and isolation. The only people I could truly rely on were my cousins, who saw through the charade and offered me the love and support I so desperately needed. But even with their help, the weight of my sister's cruelty and my parents' favoritism was crushing. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of injustice, with no way to escape. Every day was a battle, and I was losing the war. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. My sister's behavior would escalate to new heights of manipulation, and I would be forced to confront the harsh reality of just how far she was willing to go to maintain her status as the golden child. The stage was set for a showdown that would change everything, but at the time, all I could do was endure the pain and hope for a better tomorrow. My lifeline, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak existence. While my parents and sister seemed determined to crush my spirit, my cousins and other relatives offered me a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe freely and feel like I mattered. This support didn't come without its own set of challenges, though. My parents' obsession with maintaining the illusion of a perfect, Family meant they were careful not to let their mistreatment of me spill over into public view. They treated my cousins and other relatives with a level of respect they never showed me, which only made their hypocrisy more glaring. But even within this twisted dynamic, my extended family saw through the facade. They noticed the subtle ways I was sidelined, the way my sister's whims always took precedence, and how I was constantly punished for things I didn't do. One pivotal moment came during a family gathering when my cousins invited me to an event. I hesitated, knowing my parents would never allow it, but my frustration boiled over, and I blurted out the truth. I'm not allowed to go anywhere because I'm not allowed to have friends. My sister doesn't have any, so I can't either. The room fell silent, and I could see the shock on everyone's faces. My parents, of course, were furious. They scolded me for lying and grounded me for a month, but the damage was done. The adults in the family had heard the truth, and they weren't going to let it slide. Behind closed doors, they confronted my parents, demanding answers for why I was being treated so unfairly. I don't know exactly what was said, but for the first time I felt a tiny shift in the balance of power. My parents, desperate to save face, gave me a bit more freedom after that. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me from completely losing myself. My cousins became my allies, sneaking me out for small adventures and offering me a sense of normalcy. They didn't understand why my sister was so cruel or why my parents enabled her behavior, but they didn't need to. What mattered was that they saw me, they heard me, and they stood by me. Their support gave me the strength to keep going, even when my sister's bullying escalated and my parents' favoritism became more unbearable. It was through their eyes that I began to see my worth, to realize that I didn't deserve the treatment I was getting at home. They reminded me that there was a world beyond the walls of my toxic household, a world where I could be loved and valued for who I was. And though I didn't know it yet, that world was closer than I thought. Amid the suffocating atmosphere of my own home, where my parents' favoritism and my sister's cruelty reigned supreme, my extended family became my lifeline. While my immediate family seemed determined to crush my spirit, my cousins, aunts, and uncles offered me a glimmer of hope and a sense of belonging that I desperately needed. They were the ones who saw through the facade of my sister's golden child status and recognized the injustice I was enduring. Without them, I might have been completely consumed by the isolation and emotional abuse that defined my daily life. It all came to a head during a family gathering when I was still young. My cousins, who were closer to me in age and far more empathetic than my sister, invited me to join them for an outing. I remember the sinking feeling in my chest as I had to decline, explaining that I wasn't allowed to go anywhere because my sister didn't have any friends, and my parents didn't want me to have any either. The words tumbled out of me in a moment of raw honesty, and I didn't realize the impact they would have. My cousins were horrified, and they didn't hesitate to share what I'd said with the adults in the family. The fallout was immediate and explosive. My parents were confronted by my aunts and uncles, who demanded to know why I was being treated so unfairly. For the first time, I saw a crack in my parents' armor, a flicker of shame as they tried to defend their actions. But the damage was done. The truth was out, and my extended family wasn't going to let it slide. While my parents tried to save face by scolding me for lying and grounding me for a month, the dynamic in our household shifted ever so slightly. My parents, perhaps fearing further judgment from the family, gave me a bit more freedom after that incident. It wasn't much, but it was enough to breathe a little easier. My cousins became my refuge. They were the ones who listened to me when I needed to vent, who included me in their plans, and who reminded me that I wasn't the problem my family was. They saw the way my sister manipulated our parents and how I was constantly punished for things I didn't do. They even witnessed her attempts to sabotage my friendships and social life, something my parents always dismissed as sibling rivalry. But to my cousins, it was clear that this was more than just rivalry, it was emotional warfare. Despite the small victories, the tension at home never fully dissipated. My sister, furious that her lack of friends had been exposed, doubled down on her efforts to control me. She changed schools, but her behavior only grew more toxic. Meanwhile, my parents continued to favor her, even as my extended family tried to intervene. It was a constant battle, but knowing I had allies in my cousins gave me the strength to keep going. They were my safe haven, the ones who reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight. Without them, I might have lost myself completely in the chaos of my family's dysfunction. As if the constant emotional manipulation and favoritism at home weren't enough, my sister's interference extended into my romantic life, turning what should have been innocent teenage relationships into a battlefield. Every time I thought I'd found a sliver of happiness, she was there, ready to sabotage it with her lies and theatrics. My parents, of course, always took her side, believing her every word without question. It was as if she had a sixth sense for when I was starting to feel hopeful, and she'd swoop in to crush it before I could even enjoy it. My first boyfriend was a sweet guy, and I was thrilled to finally have someone who seemed to genuinely care about me. But my sister couldn't stand to see me happy. One day, while we were at home, she deliberately separated us and then cornered him in the living room. She showed up in skimpy clothing, batting her eyelashes and spewing lies about how terrible I was and how much better she was. My boyfriend, bless him, was completely unnerved and immediately came to find me to tell me what had happened. But when my sister realized her plan hadn't worked, she ran to our parents with a twisted version of the story, claiming he had tried to flirt with her. Predictably, my parents believed her without hesitation. They accused me of dating a horrible boy and forbade me from seeing him again. I tried to keep the relationship going in secret, but the constant pressure and lies made it impossible, and it eventually fell apart. Not long after, I started dating another guy, and once again, my sister couldn't resist meddling. This time, she accused him of flirting with her when he rejected her advances. My parents, ever her loyal enablers, took her side and used it as proof that I had bad judgment when it came to relationships. They even went so far as to say I was incapable of making good choices, as if my sister's lies were somehow my fault. The strain of constantly defending myself and my boyfriends against her accusations became too much, and that relationship also crumbled under the weight of her manipulation. The worst part was how my parents used these incidents to further control me. They'd say things like, "Why can't you be more like your sister? She knows how to pick good people." It was infuriating and heartbreaking all at once. Meanwhile, my sister paraded her own boyfriend around the house, and my parents showered him with praise, comparing him to my terrible choices. But when that relationship inevitably ended, they suddenly changed their tune, calling him a conniving bastard who had tricked her. The hypocrisy was staggering, but by then I was used to it. My sister's interference didn't stop at high school. Even as we grew older, she continued to insert herself into my romantic life, determined to ensure I never found happiness. It was as if she couldn't bear the thought of me having something she didn't. Every relationship I tried to build was met with her lies, my parents' disapproval, and the crushing weight of their favoritism. By the time I met my future husband, I had learned to keep my relationships far away from my family. But even then, my sister's shadow loomed large, a constant reminder of how far she was willing to go to maintain her status as the golden child. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, I had come to a grim realization. If I wanted any chance at a future free from my family's suffocating control, I would have to take matters into my own hands. My sister, the golden child, had already been accepted into a mediocre college with no scholarships, and my parents were more than happy to foot the bill for her education. But when it came to me, their tone was drastically different. My mother sat me down one evening, her voice dripping with false sympathy, and delivered the crushing news. They couldn't afford to pay for my college because they were already supporting my sister. She suggested I start working immediately after graduation and wait until my sister finished her degree before even considering higher education. The kicker? If I stayed at home, I'd have to pay rent and contribute to household expenses. It was a slap in the face, but by then I was used to their blatant favoritism. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for years. The constant isolation and restrictions they imposed on me had one unintended benefit. I had plenty of time to study. While my sister partied and flaunted her freedom, I buried myself in books, determined to turn my academic achievements into a ticket out of that toxic household. I knew my parents would never support me, so I focused on securing scholarships. I poured every ounce of energy into my grades, extracurriculars, and scholarship applications, fueled by a burning desire to escape. When the acceptance letters started rolling in, I didn't tell my parents right away. I knew they'd find a way to sabotage my plans, especially if my sister got wind of it. Instead, I waited until I had secured a full scholarship to a decent college, nothing Ivy League, but enough to give me a fresh start. Then I made my move. I announced my achievement on social media, making sure to tag my parents and thank them for their support. It was a calculated risk, but I knew they wouldn't dare stop me once the rest of the family found out. Sure enough, my parents initially tried to play the proud parents, but their tone quickly shifted when my sister got involved. She was furious, and my parents suddenly started questioning my decision, warning me that I'd suffer in college because I wasn't as smart or capable as her. But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I had something they couldn't take away from me. College became my sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe and be myself without fear of judgment or sabotage. I thrived academically and socially, far away from my sister's toxic influence and my parents' favoritism. It wasn't easy. I had to work part-time to cover expenses my scholarship didn't, but it was worth it. For the first time, I felt like I had control over my own life. My sister, on the other hand, dropped out of college and moved back home, still clinging to her golden child status. But by then, I was already on my way to building a future they couldn't touch. College wasn't just an education, it was my freedom. The final straw came not with a whisper, but with a demand so audacious it could only be born from decades of unchecked entitlement. As my husband and I planned our wedding day meant to celebrate our escape from the toxicity of my family, my parents and sister unveiled a scheme so grotesque it felt ripped from a daytime soap opera. They insisted that my sister, the eternally coddled golden child, deserved to walk down the aisle before me, clad in a wedding dress, to experience the moment she'd been denied by my selfish decision to marry first. The request wasn't just insulting. It was a declaration of war. But this time I wasn't alone. My husband, a man who thrived on poetic justice, saw an opportunity to turn their cruelty into their undoing. Together, we crafted a plan so deliciously vengeful it would leave them humiliated and exposed publicly. It began innocently enough. My parents demanded to meet my fiancé, claiming they wanted to bless our union. I knew better. My husband, however, was giddy with anticipation. He arrived at their house armed with a hidden recorder, ready to weaponize their arrogance. What he captured was beyond belief. My parents, my sister simpering beside them, hide them, laid out their terms. She would wear a wedding dress, she would walk first, and she would have her own cake and photo shoot at my venue. Their reasoning? It's only fair, my mother sniffed, since you're stealing our chance to be the first bride. My sister added, you owe me this after ruining my life. The audacity was staggering, but my husband played along, feigning reluctant agreement to keep the peace. When he returned home, euphoric with the evidence, we laughed until tears streamed down our faces, then got to work. The plan was simple: string them along, drain their resources, and humiliate them at the altar. We let them believe they'd won, all while orchestrating their downfall. First, we agreed to their demands, but with a twist. My husband, channeling his inner con artist, convinced them that I was too controlling and paranoid to let anything be documented. All discussions had to be in person, leaving no paper trail. They ate it up, relishing a chance to paint me as the villain. Meanwhile, we milked their wallets dry. At venue tastings, my husband would sigh over the cheapest menu options, lamenting, we can't possibly ask your parents to pay for this. My sister, ever the opportunist, would immediately demand upgrades. And my parents, eager to please her, footed the bill for lobster, top-shelf liquor, and a photographer whose fees could have funded a small vacation. The dress saga was a masterpiece. My mother insisted I wear a frumpy, outdated gown she'd picked, a not-so-subtle jab at my unworthiness. We pretended to comply, but my husband accidentally spilled red wine on it during a fitting, forcing them to panic buy a replacement. Meanwhile, I secretly ordered my dream dress, hiding it at a cousin's house. The piece de resistance, however, was the security plan. We hired a brick-wall bodyguard to bar my sister from the venue, but kept him hidden until the last moment. To sell the illusion, my husband brought scraps of my ruined dress to my parents, claiming I'd discovered their scheme and thrown a fit. She's onto us, he whispered wide-eyed as my sister clapped her hands in glee. But don't worry, I'll handle her. The wedding day dawned like a storm. My parents arrived early, smug and oblivious, while my sister lurked nearby in her tacky knockoff gown. As guests filtered in, our alive, fiery cousin posed as a coordinator, directing my parents to their seats while our hidden security guard took position. The ceremony began, the music swelled, and my father stood ready to escort. No one? Because when the doors opened, it wasn't my sister who stepped into the spotlight, it was me, radiant in my hidden gown, arm in arm with my husband's father. The crowd gasped as my parents' faces turned ashen. Panicked, my father's phone rang my sister, screaming outside the venue, barred by security. "There's already a bride here," the guard deadpanned as guests craned their necks to watch the meltdown. Chaos erupted. My mother sprinted to the entrance, screeching about family betrayal, while my sister collapsed in a heap, her dress tearing as she wailed. My husband, ever the showman, strode to the microphone and played the recording of their demands for the entire crowd. The room fell silent, then exploded in outrage. My aunt stood and shouted, "You should be ashamed," while others filmed the spectacle on their phones. My parents, exposed and trembling, tried to flee, but our security blocked their exit. "Stay," my husband said coolly. "You wouldn't want to miss your daughter's big day." In the end, they slunk away, their reputation in tatters. My sister's humiliation was complete, her social media flooded with videos of her tantrum, her golden image shattered. As my husband and I danced at our reception, surrounded by loved ones who'd chosen us, I realized this wasn't just revenge. It was emancipation. The girl who'd once cowered in her sister's shadow had orchestrated a coup, and the golden child's crown had melted to dust. The wedding may have ended, but the war was far from over. My parents and sister, humiliated and exposed in front of the entire family, launched a campaign of venomous retaliation that bordered on unhinged. They bombarded my phone with calls and texts, their messages swinging wildly between tearful accusations, "How could you betray us?" and thinly veiled threats, "You'll regret this." My sister, unshackled from any pretense of dignity, left rambling voicemails that devolved into screaming fits, her words slurred with rage. "You ruined my life," she shrieked in one message, followed by the clatter of objects being thrown, a sound I knew all too well from years of her tantrums. My husband, ever the strategist, refused to let their chaos derail our newfound peace. He transformed into a human firewall, intercepting every attempt to breach our boundaries. When my sister sent a novel-length email accusing him of manipulating me and scheming to steal her spotlight, he didn't delete it. Instead, he screenshot every deranged paragraph along with my parents' guilt-tripping texts, "Family forgives," "Come home and apologize," and dumped them all into the family group chat. The caption? "Guess who's still obsessed with us?" The fallout was instant. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years flooded the chat with outrage, calling my parents disgraceful and my sister unhinged. My aunt even threatened to disown them if they didn't stop. "You've done enough damage." But my sister couldn't resist one last act of sabotage. Days before our honeymoon, she created fake social media accounts to message my husband's employer, claiming he was abusive and unstable. Thankfully, my husband had anticipated this. He'd already warned his boss about her theatrics and provided the wedding recordings as proof of her instability. When HR called, he laughed and forwarded them the audio of her screeching about two-faced snakes. The result? My sister's accounts were reported, and my husband's job remained untouched. My parents, realizing their threats held no power, resorted to emotional blackmail. They showed up unannounced at our apartment, sobbing on the doorstep about family unity. But we'd changed the locks and installed a camera. My husband greeted them through the intercom, his voice icy. "Leave or I'll post the video of this." They fled, but not before my mother hissed, "You'll never be free of us." She was wrong. We lawyered up, sending a cease and desist letter that outlined their harassment and warned of legal action. The silence that followed was deafening. My extended family, armed with screenshots and recordings, became our shield, cutting my parents and sister out of gatherings and group chats. The golden child's reign had crumbled, her allies evaporated. Yet, in the quiet moments, I wondered if they'd ever truly stop. My husband, ever the optimist, grinned and said, "Let them try. I've got a whole list of countermoves." But for now, the storm had passed. Their voices faded to white noise, drowned out by the life we'd built, a fortress of our own making, impervious to their poison. The girl who once cowered in shadows now held the keys to her freedom, and no amount of screaming could ever lock her away again. For years, the question haunted me, why? Why was I the villain in my own family's story, while my sister basked in their adoration? The answer I eventually pieced together was buried in the shadows of their shame and selfishness. My parents had struggled for years to conceive my sister, Their miracle child, and her arrival was met with fanfare that bordered on worship. But when I came along unplanned, unexpected just a year later, I was not a blessing but a burden. Financial strain, resentment, and the crushing weight of their own failures twisted their hearts. I was the living reminder that their perfect family narrative was a lie. My sister, the golden child, became their redemption arc. I was the scapegoat, the collateral damage of their fragile egos. This revelation didn't come in a single moment, but in 1,000 cuts. As a child, I'd overheard my mother snap at a relative. We didn't plan for two. Later, I found old photo albums where my sister's baby pictures filled entire pages, while mine were crammed into the corners like afterthoughts. My parents never outright admitted it, but their actions screamed the truth. I was an inconvenience, a mistake they resented but couldn't erase. My sister, meanwhile, weaponized their guilt, leaning into her role as the wanted child with a smirk. She taught me with whispers of, "They never wanted you, they told me so," and for years I believed her. But understanding the why didn't heal the wounds. It simply gave me the clarity to stop begging for their love. The wedding fiasco was the final crack in the dam, but it was my husband who helped me dismantle it completely. One night, as I spiraled over a voicemail from my mother, "You've destroyed this family," he handed me a journal and said, "Write it all. Every lie, every cruelty. Then burn it." I did, pages filled with decades of pain, and as I watched the flames devour the words, I felt the chains loosen. The aftermath of our wedding revenge wasn't just a victory, it was a rebirth. My parents and sister, exiled by the extended family and exposed as frauds, faded into irrelevance. Meanwhile, my husband and I built a life untethered from their toxicity. We moved across the country, bought a house with a garden where no one could scream insults through the windows, and adopted a dog whose loyalty put my families to shame. But the true triumph came in quieter moments. The first holiday where I didn't flinch at the sound of a phone ringing. The first birthday where my cake was my favorite flavor. The first time I realized I hadn't thought about them in weeks. Years later, at the birth of our daughter, I held her in my arms and made a silent vow. You will never know what it is to be unloved. When my parents somehow learned of her existence and sent a tepid letter, "We'd like to meet our granddaughter," I didn't rage or crumble. I simply wrote back, "You lost the right to call yourselves family long ago." My husband framed their letter as a reminder of how far we'd come, hanging it beside our wedding photos like a trophy. My sister's downfall was poetic in its mundanity. With no one left to manipulate, her life unraveled. She drifted through dead-end jobs, her looks fading and her tantrums now met with eye rolls instead of indulgence. When she tried to reconnect via a drunken email blaming me for her failed engagement, I didn't respond. The silence was my closure. Today, my happiness is a quiet, steadfast thing. My husband's family embraced me as one of their own, his mother declaring, "You're the daughter we always wanted." My cousins, once my lifeline, now visit with their children, our laughter echoing in a home filled with light. And when I think of my parents, it's without bitterness. They are ghosts, their voices drowned out by the life I've chosen. The girl who once cowered in the dark now stands in the sun, her scars a testament not to her pain, but to her resilience. The golden child's crown is rusted, but mine forged in fire and defiance shines brighter than ever. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a lifetime of choosing myself. And in that choice, I found not just freedom, but peace.